I've been on a pretty good number of roller coasters. Everything from fantastic ones to terrible ones. Here are 10 of the worst roller coasters I have ever been on. I've been on a pretty decent number of roller coasters over the course of my life and had a great time riding them. I really started getting into roller coasters back in the late 1990s, and since then have been on quite a number of coasters. I've really enjoyed most of them, have a great time riding. There's been some absolutely fantastic, incredible rides I've been on. But of course, not every roller coaster can be that kind of a ride, and some of them are pretty bad. Here are 10 of the absolute worst coasters I have been on. Keep in mind, some of these are going to go back a few years, but these are my experiences at the time that I rode them. And my experiences probably were not unusual, which is probably a good part of the reason why most of these don't exist anymore. Number 10, Raging Wolf Bobs at Six Flags Worlds of Adventure. Yes, this is the park that was known as Geauga Lake, and then Six Flags bought it and merged it with SeaWorld and turned it into a huge park, and then eventually sold it off to Cedar Point. And Cedar Fair, the owners of Cedar Point, then basically wrecked the park, leveled it, and it's gone now. But at the time I got to visit it, it was a Six Flags park. Raging Wolf Bob's was a wood roller coaster, and it had these trains on it that were called PTC trailer trains. And basically what that meant was that each train only had one set of wheels, and it had a trailer axle that hooked it to the next one, and that helped hold it up. Most roller coaster trains that have more than one seat have two sets of wheels in them. These, though, because they were trailered, they rode a little bit differently. The track had not been well kept at the time, and it shuffled and banged and slammed its way around this track, and at the time, back in 2002, it was terrible. In fact, my comments that I wrote at the time are filled with comments like shuffling, banging, slamming, crunching, mashing. Not painful, but not smooth and not a good ride and really kind of sad. At the time, I attributed it to the trains. They eventually replaced the trains, and then they retracked the coaster after I rode it, and I never got a chance to go back and ride it again. From what I heard, that improved it a lot, but it was pretty bad in 2002. It did last, I believe, all the way up until Cedar Fair leveled the park, and it's now gone because of that. But at the time I rode it, yeah, it wasn't a good coaster at all. Number 9, T2, now known as T3, because it keeps counting up. This is a Vekoma suspended looping coaster that exists at Kentucky Kingdom. Honestly, for me, it secured why these coasters are known in the roller coaster enthusiast community as hangin' bangs, because it slammed me all over the place. Some of the newer models now have a new restraint system where instead of having these hard shoulder pads there, it actually has straps that help hold you in, and that's got to be an improvement. I had actually been on a pretty good one. Kong at Six Flags Discovery Kingdom, back when I rode it years ago, was pretty smooth. But T2, oh my goodness, I came off of it with such a headache and it hurt. And unfortunately, I'm at this perfect height where a lot of coasters with shoulder restraints, my head just fits perfectly. And so if it slams, I'm getting the stuffing beat out of me. And T2, it beat me to death. Number 8, Hercules at Dorney Park. Hercules was a wood roller coaster built by Summers and Dillon. As I recall, when we rode this, it was in 2001, as part of the same trip that I had my bad stop at Cedar Point. We were on our way to the Phoenix Fall Fun Fest at Knoebels. We had been on it just after it rained, so it wasn't as bad as it could have been. It had a little bit of lubrication. We went up about 150 feet in the air, and then you came down over the water with this sharp turn at the bottom of the drop, and it just slammed you into that seat. After the slam of the turn, which kind of smashed your spine together, continued on the rest of its course, but it never got going anywhere. Part of it was there was a trim on the drop. If you put a trim brake on the first drop of a coaster, okay, I already don't like the coaster because that's just lame. But at the same time, I can't imagine how bad that first turn would have been without it. And then you get to the rest of the course and you're just kind of meandering through. We were actually going so slow at one point on this roller coaster that as we approached one of the last hills, we honestly wondered if we were going to make it up because it was crawling. We joked that if we took all of our rain ponchos and hoods and stuff and opened them up, that we would have stopped the train and valleyed. It was that slow. And yet, somehow, being slow like that, it still hurts some. There was a reason that it was called Hurt Your Knees instead of Hercules. A couple of my friends that were in the group, they actually went back and wrote it again later, and they told us that we actually had a really good ride compared to what they got later on in the day. Thanks, Nate, for sacrificing yourself for us. Just a terrible coaster. It used to be where Medusa now sits at Dorney, and just not a good example of a coaster, and honestly, no loss at all with this demise. Number 7, the Green Lantern. What the Green Lantern is it's an attempt at the 4D where the seats are on the outside and they rotate and spin. But the way they design this thing is when you come around the ends on it and you do that sharp drop, it slams you into your restraints and slams you in your seat. And so instead of having a smooth spinning rotation, it's a slam, bang, ow. Okay, ow. And then you're just kind of bracing until you get to the next flip. And then again, it's a slam, bang, ow. At the time that we visited, my nephew was actually going to ride with me, and he got a little scared and nervous and decided to bail. And I'm honestly very grateful he did because it was a terrible ride. They do have a newer version of it out that Six Flags Over Texas has, and a couple others that I found much, much better. Different manufacturer, smoother, and a much more fun ride. We enjoyed those. The Green Lantern, yuck. Tear it down. Number 6, Son of Beast. Now here is a classic coaster that a lot of people have heard about, but not a lot of people have ridden. I got to ride it when it still had the loop, and it was a unique experience. It was the first modern wood roller coaster with a loop on it. Since then, Rocky Mountain Coaster has now shown how to do a wood coaster right with loops and inversions. But at the time, this one wasn't. From the very moment you get into the cars, they just smash you in. There's a foot bar that kind of crunches in around your calf level, and then the lap bar, and it was just extremely uncomfortable to even get into the cars. You come out of the station, you head up the lift hill, and it had to be the noisiest, loudest lift hill I have ever been on in my life. Why? No clue. But it was so loud, I actually had to turn and shout to the person next to me so they could hear me. They were yelling at me and I could barely hear them. And I had good hearing at the time, not like now. You then get up and its whole layout was extremely uncreative. It was basically a bunch of giant helixes, which is where it goes around like this. Helix, helix, turn, helix. Just boring. And the whole time it's doing that, it's slamming you and jackhammering you. Oh my goodness. Talk about shaken baby syndrome, and everybody on the train is a shaken baby. It hurt. The only decent part of the ride was actually the loop, because it was the only time that it ran smooth all the way through the loop and quiet compared to everything else. And hey, this is nice. And then you're right back to the... There's a reason that this coaster shook itself apart and pieces fell off. So what did they do to try to fix it? They took out the only decent part of the ride, which was the loop. Sorry guys, the rest of the ride was crud. If you take out the good, all you're left with is crud. Honestly, one of the worst roller coasters I have ever been on. Good riddance to bad rubbish. Number 5, Mantis at Cedar Point. I got to ride Mantis back in 2002, and I've been on a number of stand-up roller coasters. I've been on the Georgia Scorcher, I've been on the Iron Wolf, I've been on Vortex in California, been on Riddler's Revenge. So there's a number of stand-up coasters I've been on, and generally I enjoy stand-up roller coasters. I also know how to ride them. There is a little bit of a trick when you get on. You don't sit down. Every time I saw somebody do that in Magic Mountain, I'd laugh at them because I knew they were going to come back singing soprano. There is a way to position the seat so that you have a little bit of comfort room, if you will, but you're still securely in there. Well, this is the first strike against Mantis. One of the meanest, rudest operators I've ever seen. Is there's a way that you can position your legs, keeping straight, standing straight so that you're comfortable. And he wouldn't let me do it. Up to the point where he was actually slapping my legs. Okay, don't touch the guests that way, dude. slapping my legs to get my legs into place, and then jams the seat in. Okay, first off, that's not a comfortable position to stand in regularly, let alone be on a roller coaster. This was my 2002 trip, and honestly, this was the only strike I had against the park that day was that guy. The rest of the trip was a great one. But then Mantis had a vibration and a shaking to it. And of course, that starts on the first drop when it had a trim on the drop. Remember, if you have to put a trim brake on the drop, you're lame. So we trim on the drop, and then it's just like, not a comfortable, pleasant ride. And then you add on the fact that I'm not in a comfortable position. It was one of the worst stand-ups I've ever been on. Only beat by one, and I'll talk about that one in a little bit. Just not a good ride. I have not been on it since they have redone it. Now that they have the floorless trains, I've heard generally pretty good things about it. That had to be an improvement over what it was. But Mantis, the way it was, is gone, and yeah, good riddance. It was terrible. Number 4, Mean Streak. Yes, that's right, Cedar Point has 2 in a row here. Don't worry, they're not alone. This isn't necessarily typical of the park, but it's also interesting again that this is another coaster that Cedar Point has completely redone, and the new version of it, from all accounts I've heard, is incredible. Mean Streak has been reborn as Steel Vengeance, and that's a good thing, because at the time it was known as Mean Squeak, and it was just not a pleasant coaster. How did it start? Well, guess what? On the drop, there's a trim brake. Trim brake on the drop, and then it shuffled and jackhammered the whole way around. My comment at the time actually says we proceeded to slam, bang, jackhammer, and squeak all the way around the track. Yes, there's a reason it was called Mean Squeak. Just not a fun ride in any way. I think my exact comment and description of it at the time was, this coaster is a pile. We came off the coaster, and I do remember us talking about the most effective way to burn it down because it was so bad at the time. And long overdue for them to scrap it as it was and redo it. I'm excited about the Rocky Mountain version of it now with Steel Vengeance. Everything about that looks like it is an incredible ride and vastly improved over the pile of junk and firewood that it used to be. Number 3, Batman the Escape at Six Flags Astroworld. Here is the one stand-up that I would say is worse than what Mantis used to be. Batman the Escape was horrible. Oh my goodness, this coaster was bad. 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 There was a lot of me that was kind of happy it was the last coaster of the day that I rode at Astroworld because it hurt so much. Slamming and banging and smashing and crashing its way around the course. I have a defensive riding method that I use when I have a shoulder restraint, in that I will tend to put my head out front so that way the restraints will kind of hit more here on my neck than on my head. It still doesn't feel good, but it's not as bad as getting your head slammed. Except on this coaster, it didn't work. And I couldn't avoid it. And it was just like being in a fist fight where your hands are tied behind and you can't move and they're just punching away at your head. That's kind of about how this felt. It was a ride that they had originally moved from Six Flags Magic Mountain over there, and they should have just scrapped it along the way. It was terrible. There was a lot of Astroworld that I liked, but this, no, it's not a loss to see it gone at all. Batman the Escape is one of the biggest piles of junk ever. My last 2 roller coasters were both at the same park. And it was a park that I actually lived near for several years and frequented often, and unfortunately got stuck on them often because I would have friends and family come and want to visit and want to ride those things. Oh, and I hated these 2 coasters. Number 2, Cyclone with a P at Six Flags Magic Mountain. This sat in the back of the park where Terminator is now. It's actually the place that the Sarajevo bobsleds used to sit. What was Batman the Escape that I just mentioned, where it used to sit, and they put Cyclone there, and honestly, I wonder if this plot of land is cursed. It was just a horrible, horrible wood roller coaster. There was no avoiding the constant shaking, jackhammering, slamming, banging. They tried to improve it a little bit by putting on these unique wood roller coaster trains from B&M. Now, if you're in the roller coaster enthusiast community, you think that B&M is like godlike a lot of times. They can do no wrong. They make wonderful stuff. These coaster trains sucked. They were heavy. They were uncomfortable. They didn't track well. And then you put them on a not really good roller coaster anyways, and it was a terrible ride. I can remember riding one time with a friend of mine that had come out to visit and really wanted to ride this for the credit, and I had to go with him. And so the whole way, I decided to try to make it semi-entertaining and just make noise expressing what I was feeling. And so my noise along the way was, it just hurt. Now, at least that made the ride semi-amusing because we could laugh at the ridiculousness of the sounds I was making, but it was a horrible coaster. Generally one that I avoided at all costs. So happy they got rid of it. And number 1, at Six Flags Magic Mountain, it was known as Flashback. And yes, this may actually be the single worst roller coaster I've ever been on. It was one that sat at Six Flags Magic Mountain for the end of its life, but it had actually come from a couple other parks. It was built by a company called Intamin. While they denied it later on, it had all the hallmarks of being a B&M roller coaster. The cars were 4-across seating. It had the box spine that B&M specialized in as far as the track design goes. There were all sorts of signs all over this coaster that B&M had had their hands on it. But they denied it, and I don't blame them a bit. This coaster, once you got up the top of the lift hill, it would have snap diving turns that would be just really short. You'd hit a little bump and you come around, and then you would snap dive turn again. And that's all it was one snap dive turn after another. The problem was you had a lap bar and an over-the-shoulder restraint. And every time you snap turned, your legs would slam into your lap bar and your head would slam into the shoulder restraint. And so you get a slam bam every single turn. And there was no way to defend yourself for it, no way to brace for it, because as violently as it slammed you, you could hold on as tight as you want and you were still going to slam. It was just going to beat the crud out of you. Thankfully, it didn't run most of the time, but it was like, why do you have this piece of junk here that nobody wants to ride even when it is open? And you could have put in so much better rides there. They finally tore it down. I just don't think they still put anything in its place, except maybe something from Hurricane Harbor. I don't know anybody that came off of this ride not hurting, except for my daughter one time. She was young at the time, I think like 8, and she really wanted to ride, and she was small enough that the shoulder restraints didn't slam her and she could slide a little bit in the seat without getting tossed out. So it wasn't too bad for her, but her closing comment when we got off, that sucked. So there are 10 of the worst roller coasters I have ever been on. I am sure there are other ones out there that are pretty bad as well. What are the worst ones you've been on? Maybe you actually thought one of the ones I hated was actually a pretty good ride. Well, I'd love to hear about that too. Don't forget to leave comments below and tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Or what would you add to the list? Thank you so much for your feedback and for sharing and liking the video. If you haven't already, hey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the bell so you get notified anytime I have a new video. Thank you too to my patrons for supporting me and for helping me redeem myself after riding all of those terrible coasters. Thank you so much for watching too, and God bless. But I've got a decent sample size. But yes, there are people that have been on a lot more than I have. Okay. Number 10, Raging Wolf Bob. Bobs? Bobs. Bobs. Bob, 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 Bob. Okay. Bob, 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 Sue. It used to sit where it sat, yeah. The interesting thing is, there's something on my neck. What is hopping around? Got a bug on my neck. It's driving me nuts.